So I guess we can finally get it started. Let's do our extra history series for the week. I've been running down the poll that I did a handful of weeks ago, where I had you guys select the order of the next five extra history series that I do. And I'm going to have to do a new poll pretty soon, so I'm open to suggestions from y'all for what extra history series you guys want me to check out on stream in the future. We're going to be wrapping this up. We're going to be doing Sun Yat-sen, and we've got one on the Third Crusade that we're going to be doing after this, probably next week. And then I'm going to have to get that poll up there and see what we can come up with here. So as far as Sun Yat-sen goes, I don't know anything really. A killing in Hong Kong. So it's Hong Kong, and I think this might be British Hong Kong, because Hong Kong actually was under British purview for a very long time. And although I associate Hong Kong very much with China because it got under the Chinese umbrella in, I think, 97, which is like a year after I was born. So for almost my entire life, Hong Kong has been kind of under the Chinese umbrella, which is how I'm going to communicate it. Which it's fascinating. I don't know much about British Hong Kong, but I do know that there are some elements of culture that are left behind by the British in Hong Kong to this day. And look here, it says English. Ooh, I see English words too. So I don't know. I think the signs are there that it might be British Hong Kong, and I'm curious about it. I don't know how the transition occurred. I don't think we're talking about this. I think this is a little earlier in the century. I know this is 1900s, but I don't know how early it is. So we'll see. So let's get this one started.
1901, Hong Kong. Young Kuan, architect of the Guangzhou Uprising, sits teaching English on the second floor of his house. His
It's always these
two-year-old son
intellectuals.
bounces on his lap. It feels good to be home. Exile didn't suit him. His revolutionary partner, currently living in hiding, had warned him that he was in danger, that a price was on their heads. But not here. Not in Hong Kong. The British would protect him. He keeps a revolver on his desk, though, just in case. There's a commotion on the stairs. Students look over their shoulders. The door bursts open. Gangsters enter, waving guns. Young throws his son on the floor. He lifts up a dictionary to shield himself and reaches for the revolver. His son screams. Pupils scramble out of the way. The gang leader fires. Young thumps face down on the desk. The assassins flee downstairs and disappear into the narrow alleys, excited to collect their bounty.
They're just
from
so
Qing
delighted.
officials. Rebels die. That's the rule. And there was no greater rebel than young Kuan. Well, there was one. The man's partner, Sun Yat-sen.
Cool. We've already got action here. We've got an assassination. We got scandal. This is already amazing. I mean, if you're gonna, sometimes they don't. You gotta lead with the action, even if you're starting in the middle of the story. You gotta lead with something to hook them. That's what people do in books. The introduction is always like somewhere at the end or somewhere like in the climax of the story, and then they'll bring you back, or some like weird anecdote that really is supposed to hook you. Like, oh, this person's interesting. Let's learn about them.
Honolulu, Hawaii, 1879. Sun Yat-sen would have many names in his life. All Chinese men did then. He'd have his genealogical name, his baptism name, his courtesy name, but he would also have others. Names with false passports to back them up. Names he'd use in hiding.
Oh, is this
Because
guy?
Sun was a dangerous man. The Qing were right to fear him. After all, he'd bring 2,000 years of imperial rule crashing down. But in 1879, he was just Sun Wen, a student
Okay,
in Hawaii.
so this is before British control. Is this the story of how they got under British control? I think this is before British control, right? Hold on, let me just, so I don't start saying the wrong thing for like the entire video, I do want to get a timeline here. When did the British control Hong Kong? Let's see what we got here. So now, okay, so it's 1898, but between 1842 and 1898, the British Empire gradually seized control of the three main regions that make up modern-day Hong Kong. Okay. But it, like, started at 1898. Okay, and it ended, yeah, like I said, in 1997. Okay, this is complex. This is already very, very complex. But I know it ends in 1997, so we're... Oh, it has one period as a crown colony, which is 1843 to 1941, and that... But the British dependent... Oh, that's British dependent territory, which is 1981 to 1997. I don't know how much different that is. That's probably during, like, a transitionary period or something like that. Hey! Shut up! Okay, we're gonna continue this.
Hawaii, one of 7 Chinese at his largely Hawaiian Anglican boarding school. He'd been born in southern China, the son of poor peasants, at a time when there was little opportunity for boys like him. His family were not scholars who could get him a government position. The stagnant economy promised no upward mobility. Instability ruled back home. The largest revolt in centuries, the Taiping Rebellion, had ended only 2 years before his birth. Ever since the British took Hong Kong in the Opium Wars, foreign countries were scrambling for larger and larger chunks of Chinese territory. Now, they were flooding the market with cheap manufactured goods, putting Chinese artisans out of work. Foreign steamships sailed up the rivers, bringing in goods and bringing out coal. Opium still ravaged the country. Imperial attempts at modernization inevitably failed due to mismanagement and corruption. Even when the government did adopt new technologies, like steamships, they had to finance them through foreign capital and hire foreign engineers. And yet the Qing government, a northern ethnic minority perceived as foreign occupiers...
You don't see the video? Oh no! Why did nobody tell me?
I'm sorry.
No, that was my fault. I forgot to switch the thing back on.
Yeah, but
there we go. My bad.
I told you if I was able to watch.
A time when there was little opportunity for boys like him.
There we
His
go.
family
Sorry about
were
that,
not
guys.
Scholars who could get him a government position. The stagnant economy promised no upward mobility. Instability ruled back home. The largest revolt in centuries, the Taiping Rebellion, had ended only 2 years before his birth. Ever since the British took Hong Kong in the Opium Wars, foreign countries were scrambling for larger and larger chunks of Chinese territory. Now, they were flooding the market with cheap manufactured goods, putting Chinese artisans out of work. Foreign steamships sailed up the rivers, bringing in goods and bringing out coal. Opium still ravaged the country. Imperial attempts at modernization inevitably failed due to mismanagement and corruption. Even when the government did adopt new technologies, like steamships, they had to finance them through foreign capital and hire foreign engineers. And yet the Qing government, a northern ethnic minority perceived as foreign occupiers, kept insisting on the supremacy of their culture and deciding there was no need for change. Many Chinese had gone overseas. In fact, Sun's own brother went to the Kingdom of Hawaii to work in the sugarcane fields and soon saved up for a shop and ranch. Sun and his mother followed him. The schools were better, that was sure. At least they were for lucky kids with brothers who made enough to pay the tuition. Here, unlike his village school, he got an education that opened the world. He picked up English fast. So fast that he was soon writing for the school newspaper, and received an award from the king. But that wasn't all. He learned about British and American legal systems, constitutional government, democracy, and Western history, with an emphasis on the American Revolution, Glorious Revolution, and unification of Germany and Italy. When he graduated, he moved on to college-level courses at a missionary school. Here, the
learning about the American Revolution has been a good start for a lot of revolutionaries. The French Revolution, of course, it hasn't happened yet here, but like the Ho Chi Minh uh, was well read on the American Revolution, and when kind of communicating his ideals to the world, he ends up basically lifting a lot of American revolutionary language as sort of a way like, see, we're just like you, which is kind of genius. Uh, so that this is not at all surprising.
Curriculum was more specifically American, imbued with a particular brand of New World optimism and dogma of self-betterment. But it also exposed him to Protestantism. And when he came home one day asking permission to be baptized, his brother figured enough was enough. He sent Sun home. But those years in Hawaii had changed the 17-year-old Sun. He now saw his village as backwards and superstitious, and tried to fix that by tearing down one of the gods at the local temple. The act got him banished, and there was only one place for him to go. Hong Kong, 1883. Hong Kong was something totally different from Honolulu. This was a true city, a little Victorian England in the middle of Asia. Technology,
That's kind of
banking,
amazing.
modern transportation, clean streets, and massive buildings. The contrast between his
Now it's so normal to have like these very westernized Asian countries. We've talked about this earlier today with like Japan and South Korea being like prime examples of countries that have like these very strong Western influences. And now, to a great degree, they influence the West as well. It's kind of like a reciprocal relationship of popular influence between them. The United States, in our pop culture, very much we really enjoy like things that are Japanese, and we're starting to really appreciate things that are South Korean and all that. But like Hong Kong at its time, it was like kind of ahead of the game on that, being like this, not necessarily by choice as like a product of like imperialism, but it is what it is.
poor village and this metropolis laid bare to him how foolish the Qing had been not to modernize. He was only 50 miles from home. The next few years were a blur. He enrolled in college, got married, his parents arranged it, and was baptized a Christian. Sun decided he wanted to help people,
Ooh.
so he got a medical degree. But Hong Kong didn't recognize his degree. So he opened a pharmacy in Macau and later Guangzhou, earning a reputation for giving away free medicine. But medicine wasn't his only pursuit. He
Drugs.
developed a group of friends in Hong Kong, middle-class
Gotta be
professionals like
drugs.
him who loved to talk politics. Several had connections with anti-Qing societies, and they began talking openly about overthrowing the emperor.
Okay, guys, where does that fall as far as like dragons on flags goes? I don't know if it beats Wales, but it might give Bhutan a run for its money. I don't know. I still think Bhutan kind of beats it out, but let me know what you think. It's always interesting seeing dragon flags.
And replacing him with a democracy, theoretically at first, then in specifics. The group became so notorious for their radical talk, people nicknamed them the Four Desperados. And as they talked, the century of humiliation marched on. The Qing lost Korea to the Japanese, and Vietnam to France. Western countries were building railways through the country, with corridors along the tracks where Chinese law didn't apply. The Empress Dowager increasingly pulled strings of government. More Chinese territory got ceded to foreign control. Everyone from Germany to Italy to Belgium was taking a piece. But there was an undercurrent of hope. In 1884, he'd seen Hong Kong dock workers refuse to repair a French warship damaged while fighting Chinese forces. And he met men in Hong Kong who believed it was possible to reform the Qing state. He found their arguments persuasive and decided to offer his ideas directly to the government. In 1894, he traveled to Beijing, both to see the capital and to file a petition with his recommendations for reform.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that Hong Kong as a product is like inherently a negative thing. because it was influenced by the West or anything like that, but it was a product of imperialism, no doubt. And like there is something inherently kind of icky about it's like, do the ends justify the means? I don't know. Maybe. I I don't like to say so, but you know.
Reforming agriculture, opening free trade, and leveraging China's human skill. He tried to deliver the letter to a government official known as a champion of reform. The man refused to see him. This rejection incensed Sun, but it was more than that. The wealth he saw displayed in Beijing, the open corruption, drove every thought of reform from his mind. The ineffectual Qing must be overthrown, and he knew just where to start. Honolulu. 20
Revolution.
men crowd into a 2-story wooden house.
Oh, Honolulu.
Dr. Sun is there, along with his brother. They all know what this gathering is about. This is the first meeting of the Revived China Society, a secret revolutionary organization dedicated to overthrowing the Qing. I'm a doctor, says Sun, but before treating my patients, I must first cure my country. But to do that, he would need money. This overseas chapter will primarily...
Is a local despot any better than a distant despot? I don't know, honestly. Because I guess it depends. Like, if you're comparing in things that inherently sound negative, it's hard to actually pick a side. One could say that somebody more local could relate to the people a little bit better. I'd say that the British Empire always had a difficult time relating to the people that it colonized, though it did better in some places than it did in the Americas. I will say that. It's hard to paint it with like a broad brush. I take it in a case-by-case basis or something. Inherently, a despot is like an icky, bad, gross, get that out of my face sort of thing.
Primarily be a fundraising organization. His brother had agreed to sell some of his property to help the fight. Could he count on these men? Turns out, he could. Some sold businesses. Others gave what they could or organized fundraising events. Sun's electric speeches began attracting crowds in Honolulu's Chinatown. There were 5,000 Chinese in Hawaii, he'd say. If each person gave him $1, that would be $5,000 towards the revolution.
That's a lot of money.
Few would give more than that, volunteering to come back and fight when the time came. It came sooner than anyone thought. China had fared badly in the Sino-Japanese War, suffering a series of embarrassing naval defeats that had once again exposed the corruption and incompetence of the Qing. The time was right. 3 months after founding the Revived China Society in Honolulu, Sun returned to Hong Kong to establish its global headquarters. But this Revived China Society, disguised as a social club, was more than a fundraising group. Renewing contacts from his college years, he met up with Young Kuan, founder of a literary society that was, like his social club, actually a revolutionary group. Unlike Sun, Young had deep contacts in Hong Kong and with the anti-Qing secret societies that operated in southern China. He'd been cultivating them for a revolt and acquiring weapons for 3 years. Some of these secret societies were the infamous triads, who in their centuries of anti-Qing resistance frequently turned to organized crime. Soon, ever pragmatic,
we got a theme
turned
today.
A blind eye. The two groups merged, appointing Young chairman of the Revived China Society and taking a pledge to expel the Qing, restore Chinese rule, and establish a federal republic. They greenlit the uprising. Sun's longtime friend, Liu Haotong, made them a flag to fight under, a white sun on a blue sky. It was time to rise.
I know
With
that
the war
flag.
ending,
Whoa.
thousands of discharged soldiers were milling around Guangzhou, also known as Canton. Angry,
We're getting
defeated,
familiar
and
symbols.
frequently unpaid, they were joining triad groups and revolutionary societies in steady numbers. If Sun and his comrades could start an uprising, they reasoned the people would join them. They recruited 3,000 triads. When activated, they'd assemble in Hong Kong and catch a ferry to Guangzhou. Then they'd break into units to hit their designated targets. Some would seize government offices or bottle up troops and police. Others would capture or kill local officials. Sun quietly moved to Guangzhou,
As one
presenting
does.
himself as a head of an agricultural society to explain the strange coming and goings. He set up a religion.
So we talked about the rules of ruling, I guess, before in the CGP Gray video. So it's it might be interesting to see since do have like a revolutionary uprising. It might be fun to see if there's ways in which this conforms or differs from those rules that were established there. Thus far, it's very antagonistic and taking out a lot of the established infrastructure, but that's because they haven't won yet. When they win, it's like, okay, what do we incorporate? So it's still early to say.
Religious bookshop as a front. There were spiritual pamphlets out front and an arms cache in the back. Contacts in Hong Kong shipped him loads of revolvers hidden in barrels labeled cement. Triad surveilled government buildings and shadowed targets. And they chose a date, October 26th, a festival day where busy street celebrations could provide cover as the strike force got into position. It was an auspicious date, the 9th day of the 9th lunar month. Yet it would all go so wrong.
Very fun. All right, so for some reason that felt like a really long part one. It's not. It's only 11 minutes. But for some reason it felt like very, I don't know, maybe it was just like really well told. It felt like they got a lot done. It didn't feel like it dragged or anything. It just felt like I'd gotten further into the story than we already are. So that's interessant. Let's go into part 2. Let's see what we got.
November 28, 1895, Guangzhou. Someone leaked. Across the city, police raid homes and intercept squads of would-be rebels. When the Triad strike force steps off the ferry, police meet them on the dock. Members of the revived China Society scatter, weaving through alleys, avoiding patrols. But as everyone flees, one man runs the other way. Liu Haodong, the man who designed the flag these would-be revolutionaries fight under, is headed into Guangzhou. He'd nearly escaped before he remembered something. He crashes into the bookshop they'd used as a headquarters. No soldiers? Good. He rifles around until he finds what he's looking for, the membership book. A register of everyone who's joined or supported the revived China Society.
Oh, that's
Liu
important.
hears footsteps on the street. No time. He strikes a match. The book is curled to ashes by the time the soldiers take him.
Dude, that could take down everything. If they know all the only way that wouldn't be like the end is if the membership was too big to suppress and they just didn't have the means to take care of everybody who was in it. But like overall that could like take down everyone. That guy's a champion.
Kobe, Japan. 2 weeks later.
Kobe.
Sun Yat-sen steps off the steamer, finally safe. When things went sideways, he'd gone to ground in a church, smuggling himself to Macau after dark. He booked...
Anyone have a good book about this guy? Let me know. Because like I probably won't get around to it for a very long time because I have so many things I want to check out right now, but please, this guy's interesting already. Or like just about this general situation, about this revolutionary movement, you know? I'll take anything.
Passage to Kobe, not because he had a plan, but because it was the first ship that was available. Things were bad. The revived China Society was dispersed, out of contact. He'd seen posters offering 10,000 taels of silver for his capture, and soon had been banned from Hong Kong. Worse than that, the revolution had its first martyrs. The governor of Guangzhou had executed 5 revolutionaries, including Liu Haodong. Liu, one of Sun's oldest friends, who'd helped him to face that idol all those years ago. He'd refused to talk, even under torture. But when Sun picks up a newspaper, he's shocked. The press is calling the uprising a revolution, not a rebellion. He was a revolutionary. A fugitive revolutionary, he reminded himself, living in exile. And he needed to change his appearance if he wanted to stay alive. He rented a room and cut off his queue. The act was symbolic as well as practical. The Qing mandated
Zuko.
the hairstyle by law. He bought his first set of Western clothes, shaved his unkept, on-the-run stubble down to a mustache, and slicked his hair back with pomade. He looked at himself, a changed man, one who could blend in.
Oh, like slicking your hair back with pomade, like that's a really symbolic choice depending on what culture you're from when you really value like the hair. In uh in the United States during like a good amount of the 20th century, black people would kind of like use it to like get rid of kind of the natural curliness of their hair. And it was in some ways looked at as kind of like this liberating choice where you are kind of like embracing this sort of pop culture lifestyle and like doing your thing or whatever, but it was also seen in a lot of ways as like hiding a sort of like natural part of your ethnic identity. Here I'd imagine it has to have some layers to it, especially with him like snipping that bit off. I could imagine how important that might seem.
On the streets of Japan or disappear into the Chinatowns of Hawaii, the United States, or Southeast Asia. Which was good, because he'd be living as an exile, on the run for the next 16 years. London, 1896. Nearly a year since the uprising. A very humbling year. Sun had done a tour across Hawaii and the United States, founding...
No, in America, they would conk their hair, I think is the word for it. I don't know if it's the same material. I actually, now that I think about it, I think it's like more chemically and like, I don't know. Maybe the comparison wasn't good, but like you get what I'm trying to say.
New chapters of the revived China Society and soliciting donations. It hadn't gone well. The failed uprising had made him toxic. He barely raised enough from one stop to reach the next. Overseas Chinese in America didn't seem to understand his ideas and were skeptical of whether revolution was even possible. Each meeting attracted 1 or 2 dozen people. The only bright spot was an invitation from one of his old medical professors from Hong Kong, Dr. James Cantley, to visit him in London. For Sun, it was an opportunity to study the British government, understand the workings of this colonial power, and learn more about economic theory. He saw the sights and spent days at the British Museum Library, devouring economic and social works unavailable in Asia. Each night, he dined with Cantley, asking questions and refining his ideas. And as he did so, he never noticed he was being followed. In fact, Qing agents had shadowed him since San Francisco, where he'd been careless enough to...
Did I? It's like Zuko. Yeah, I did see Avatar: The Last Airbender. I've got I don't think anyone can see it, but I've got a tattoo of Appa on my leg right here. I don't think I got my leg high enough. I'm not very flexible, but yeah, very much. And you know what? Like the comparison's not even that bad. That's a character who totally rejects his culture for a time. Oh yeah, you can see it all right. I just looked at the playback. You can see it.
to pose for a newspaper photograph. That photograph had been posted to every Chinese consulate in America, with agents tracking his every move. Indeed, the Chinese legation in London had prepared for his arrival. They'd hired a British detective agency to pick up his tail at the dock, and within a week, they knew his movements. And it just so happened that the Chinese legation was around the corner from Dr. Cantley's house, on a route Sun walked every day. The order came through. Bring him in. October 11th, a Sunday morning. Sun walks toward the Cantley's house, planning to accompany them to church, when 2 Chinese men approach him. They smile, happy to see another countryman. They invite him into their house for tea. Sun offers to come back another time, but they're insistent. They take his arms and half-jokingly pull him into an open door. He follows. Only when they bar the door does he realize his mistake.
Oh,
An
geez.
hour later, he's locked alone in a room. A man enters. An elderly British man with a big white beard. He informs Sun that this is the Chinese legation. British law doesn't apply here. And they have orders to place him under arrest. They're currently awaiting further orders from Beijing. The white-bearded man sits down, leaning on his cane, and the questioning begins. October 17th, 6 days later. Sun begs the housekeeper to help him. For days, he's tried to bribe the legation's English servants to carry messages to Cantley. Each time, they took his money and threw his notes away. He'd tried writing pleas for help and throwing them out the window, but the room they kept him in overlooks a courtyard, and the white-bearded man simply collects the notes. The man had stopped questioning him. Days before, he informed Soon that the government had booked passage on a steamer. Soon would be returned to China for execution.
Oh
Soon
man,
spent
that's
his days and nights praying
well. Clearly,
for
it's not going to
deliverance.
work out.
But now, he's breaking through with the English housekeeper. He begs her to send word to Cantley. His house is just around the corner, for pity's sake. 11:30 p.m. Dr. Cantley's doorbell rings. But when he goes downstairs to answer, he only finds a note pushed under the door. He reads it. Soon's been kidnapped. This can't wait until tomorrow. Cantley knows about Qing justice. Within hours, his favorite student could be gone. And Cantley knows a man who can help. Sir Halliday Macartney. He'd fought with the Qing during the Taiping Rebellion and has connections in the Chinese government. His house isn't far. Cantley rings the doorbell. It's the middle of the night. He starts rapping on windows, trying to wake someone, squinting to see into the dark house. No one's home. Not Macartney's wife or his servants, and especially not the white-bearded Macartney himself. He was, after all, at the Chinese legation interrogating Soon. At a loss, Cantley goes to the local police station, but it's the middle of the night on a Saturday, the time when drunks wander in telling wild stories. They dismiss him. He rushes to Scotland Yard. They take a statement and tell him to go home. He's at the Foreign Office the moment it opens. They demur. They fear taking public action would endanger British businesses in China. But the bureaucratic gears begin to turn.
Man, their financial influence is even like twisting their arm back then.
Worried that Soon might be smuggled out before authorities act, Cantley hires a private detective to watch the legation. Exhausted, he finally goes home. Waiting for him is
I think I know who that guy is a reference to.
Delivering a letter. It's from Soon, in his own handwriting, on the back of 2 of his business cards. Hard evidence. And from it, he learns that Sir Halliday Macartney is not a potential ally. He's Soon's jailer. If Macartney had been home, Cantley's request for help might have signed his death warrant. And at the exact same time, Macartney is undergoing his own revelation. Unwittingly, Cantley had hired the same detective agency the legation had used to shadow Soon. The agency sends Macartney a message. Cantley knows. It's too late to smuggle Soon out. Things are in motion. The next morning, the Foreign Office is on Scotland Yard, and within hours, the police have the legation under 24-hour surveillance. Cantley leaks the story to the press. The headlines are dynamite. Secret agents kidnapping a man on British soil. A Western-trained doctor marked for death. An English aristocrat behind the outrage. It becomes a sensation.
Way to like weaponize the press, man. Like, I love when new creature. Oh, that's freaking hilarious! It's a Pikachu.
Reporters surround the legation. The Foreign Office threatens China with diplomatic reprisals. And that afternoon, after 12 days of detention, Soon walks out the front door. And into a horde of photographers. The Qing had tried to silence him. Instead, they'd made him an international celebrity. Soon had entered the legation as a failed rebel and emerged as the face of Chinese revolution. And the press loved Soon. He was a great interviewee, intelligent, charming, and well-mannered.
He's an interesting case because he's somebody who looks like he's foreign from some way, from some angles, but also like he mirrors their culture back to them with like a different face. I think that's like a really important part of like what he is, because he is clearly obsessed with like Western culture and clearly has love for the British and all that. It's really interesting how like mirroring people's values can how far that can get you.
He was good at crafting his message to target different audiences. Westerners, he knew, liked their revolutionaries moderate. He played up his Christianity and pushed for reforms, saving his more radical ideas for Chinese ears. For as he conversed with European intelligentsia and pored over books at London libraries, he started asking questions. Capitalism had built Britain. But how could such a rich society have so many poor people? American government was an ideal, true, but it didn't live up to its tenets of racial equality. He dreamed
Yeah.
of land reform, buying properties from tycoons at fair market value and distributing it to China's landless peasants. He studied socialist thinkers and interpreted Abraham Lincoln's words, "of the people, by the people, and for the people," as both a call for participatory government and a fairer economic system. And gradually, his gaze drifted back.
That's so interesting that he pulls from Abraham Lincoln. I don't think Americans love that quote, but I don't think anybody really interprets it that way. And I don't see why more people haven't interpreted it more that way. It doesn't come off as it doesn't seem to have a lot of socialist leanings, because Americans are kind of inclined to not be fans of socialistic government. We're very individualistic, so we're much more inclined to reject things like communal obligations or collective obligations in favor of individual rights, which has its ups and downs, as you can probably tell.
Towards Asia. In London, he befriended a Japanese botanist who introduced him to a new movement, Pan-Asianism, an ideology that proposed Asian countries unifying in the fight against Western imperialism. Tokyo, he said, had become a hotbed of Chinese revolutionaries, Philippine independence activists, and Japanese ultra-nationalist syndicates. And it was awash with black market weapons. It sounded like a good
Sounds like a blast.
Soon thought. And to plan another uprising.
Let's do it. Let's see what we got. I didn't know Japan was going to be so involved. Let's see.
1897.
We're kind of going everywhere, aren't we? We were in Hong Kong in the first episode. We kind of got to dabble in the West in that second episode, and we're going to Tokyo.
Reports had been right, soon Yat-sen realizes.
This guy's
Tokyo
busy. He's like a kind of a Che Guevara of his time. Not a perfect comparison, I'm sure, because like no two revolutionaries are perfectly the same, but there's kind of like the international revolutionary ideal there.
Hotbed of revolutionaries, a mix of Chinese reformers, Philippine independence fighters, Japanese ultranationalists, and student radicals of all stripes. The Japanese government both sheltered and aided them, hoping these agitators would unite a Pan-Asian alliance and drive the Western powers out of Asia. Sun's objective was clear. Not only did he need to build a coalition from these rival groups, he needed to make them an army.
Nice.
But that goal came later. When Sun arrived in Japan, he had a simple goal: gain backdoor support from Japanese politicians and use Tokyo as a base to foment uprisings in China. As he traveled to Tokyo, he'd arranged a meeting with the country's largest Pan-Asianist organization. It was an underground society.
Yeah, he's a little bit Bolivar-esque as well. I think the Guevara example, I lean towards that because it is a more modern example by comparison. I guess more modern revolutionary tactics from the looks of it.
Society with members placed at the highest level of Japanese government.
So I don't know how successful this is. I don't know the rest of his story, so it's hard to say. Guevara had he had mixed results. I would say like not all of his ideals necessarily played out exactly how he would have wanted, but he did have like that international revolutionary fervor, and it was very ambitious, and Bolivar similarly.
Of finance.
And Bolivar clearly inspired Guevara as well, so like all these revolutionaries kind of feed into each other. I would say going back to the American Revolution, but there's influences that go back further than that too, I'm sure.
They ran off-the-books intelligence operations and aided rebel groups. Their objective? To keep Russia out of northern China, ensuring that Korea stayed in Japan's sphere of influence. They went by another name.
All right, see you in a little bit, Neron.
They christened themselves as the Black Dragon Society. And they were looking
dope.
for someone who'd overthrow the Qing and strengthen China. Sun's contact was a wild-haired adventurer named Miyazaki Toden, who'd spent years scouring China for promising revolutionaries. Their first meeting
not that guy.
was rocky. Miyazaki arrived early. Sun hadn't washed or dressed. Neither spoke the other's language well, and they had to draw Chinese characters to make themselves clear. It was the start of a lifelong friendship.
Nice.
In the end, Miyazaki passed Sun up to his handlers. The Japanese sponsors gave Sun the stamp of approval. This was their guy. Within weeks, they'd given Sun a house in Tokyo under an assumed name, and they plugged him into their network. Miyazaki would serve as representative in areas Sun couldn't travel. The alliance was not without its contradictions. Revolutionaries like Sun wanted to overthrow the Qing, particularly because it had opened the doors to Japanese imperialism. And on the other side, many Japanese Pan-Asianists didn't want to end colonialism so much as make Japan the sole colonial power. They wanted a strong China, but as a puppet state. In fact, decades later, the same ultranationalists supporting Sun would usher in an age of Japanese militarism.
We don't want to end, like, nuclear weaponry or anything. We just want to be the ones who have it. It's like that sort of thing. Like the United States, we don't have a lot of room to really judge other countries for wanting nuclear weapons because we are the ones who've actually used nuclear weapons. But we do anyway. We just would rather we had a monopoly on that. Because it gives us a sense of security.
And invade China. Yet they had what Sun needed: protection, contacts,
unique
and
power.
Access to military weapons. So he took their help, while also dispatching friends to undermine Japanese rule in Taiwan. But Sun was increasingly running into a problem. He had competition. In 1898, a group of Confucian scholars persuaded the emperor to endorse an ambitious reform program. But 100 days later, the Dowager Empress shut it down by staging a coup and putting her nephew, the emperor, under house arrest. The reformers fled to Tokyo, where their new group began poaching Sun's recruits and fundraising efforts. He reached out in hope of
The Japanese believe in a Monroe Doctrine for Asians at the time. That's a fun way of thinking about it. Like, that's a nice way to, like, package it for my American ears. I understand those words.
Forming an alliance, but the reformers refused. They were monarchists from an elite bureaucracy and wanted nothing to do with this peasant. So, Sun forged other ties. During the Spanish-American War, he covertly bought arms from the Japanese and shipped them to Philippine independence fighters. He'd hoped that a liberated Philippines would provide a new base for Chinese revolutionaries, but the arms ship sank and the revolt failed. Meanwhile, he dispatched agents throughout Southeast Asia, opening new chapters of the revived China Society and solidifying himself as the organization's sole commander. But the reformers were still outpacing them. Sun worried that the revived China Society wouldn't stay relevant. Then, fate played its bloody hand. In the years since Sun fled China, Imperial powers had become ever more bold about slicing the Chinese melon. More territory, more economic concession.
If you're heading out, sorry guys, don't mind this. If you're heading out soon, has the dog gone out?
I was about to take her.
I really appreciate that. I wasn't sure if I needed to take a break to take her out or not. Like, I'd be down, but, you know, if you're free.
She's definitely been out.
Okay.
But she has to go again.
Just making sure.
I'm bringing her.
Special rights for missionaries and Christians. At all levels of Chinese society, people feared their country would go the way of Africa. The result was backlash. The Boxer Uprising assailed Western establishments across China and besieged Beijing's foreign quarter. The Dowager Empress publicly backed them, hoping to wrest control back from the great powers. An 8-nation coalition invaded and trounced the Boxers, driving the Dowager Empress from the Forbidden City. And amidst the chaos, Sun launched his second uprising, again in southern China and again using triad societies. This time, though, the triads defeated the government troops sent to crush them. They barreled towards Guangzhou, picking up recruits, triggering a larger rising than Sun had hoped, and shortly, 10,000 men marched with them. But the plan hinged on Sun sending a cache of Japanese arms, and there'd been a change in government. Sun's supporters were out, and the government reneged on the shipment. Soon ordered the army to disperse. It was deeply frustrating. They'd poured years of resources into the revolt, and now they had to raise that money again. So
That's
Soon hit
pretty
the road on a
not
fundraising
dope.
tour, visiting overseas Chinese throughout Southeast Asia. He passed through Hawaii to obtain a forged birth certificate, then used it to cross into the United States, where non-Chinese citizens weren't allowed to travel. He joined a triad society so he could move city to city under their protection. At every stop, he saw how badly the reformists had depleted his ranks. But outlooks were starting to change. In 1904, Japan went to war with Russia, challenging them over Chinese territory they'd seized during the Boxer Uprising. The Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed 2 Russian fleets, forcing them to abandon the territory and formalizing Korea as a protectorate.
Oh, cool.
It rejuvenated
Now
Soon's
Korea
message and damaged the
is-
reform arguments. Defeating a European power was a win for Pan-Asianism, but the contrast between a rising Japan and deteriorating China highlighted Qing incompetence. Could such an impotent, weak government even be reformed? Wouldn't it be better to scrap it and start something new? China was larger than Japan in every measure, Soon told the Chinese Americans. If Japan could defeat the czars, think of what a modernized, united China could achieve. And then he reached Europe, and the tide turned. Since the Sino-Japanese War, China had made several attempts at reform, including a push to modernize education. Chinese students increasingly went overseas to study as engineers, doctors, and scholars. But mostly, they learned the business of war. The Qing was forming a
Chinese education currently is pretty good, right? I don't know what it's like today, but I believe they're known for having pretty strong education system right now, which is interesting. I know generally Asian countries have better education systems than we do in the West, at least as far as our public education systems go. It's not like the United States doesn't have good schools. We do have some good schools, but I don't know much about it.
a new army using German equipment and structure, sending the brightest cadets to train at elite military academies in Prussia and Japan. And these young, foreign-educated intelligentsia leaned towards revolution. Soon came
Hell
to Europe
yeah, they
seeking
do.
government support, but instead, a student group asked him to lecture. It was a tryout, he realized. They were looking for leadership. Soon spoke, proposing a government with the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the American model, plus two
Nice.
from the Imperial system, one for student examinations and another to police corruption. And he unveiled his 3 principles of the people, a guiding statement of what his revolution embodied. Nationalism, all Chinese ethnic groups united under one national identity. Democracy, a state with a constitutional government. And the people's livelihood, an economic platform to combat poverty, reform land codes, and establish taxes. The student revolutionaries endorsed him, and magic started to happen.
Oh,
One of the
yeah.
things that had held Soon back was a lack of elite support. But now, he was among the up-and-comers of the new generation, who saw him as a key to the revolution. After all, once they overthrow the Qing, they'll need someone with foreign connections who can talk the great powers out of an intervention. And Soon was that man. The students, for their part, brought publishing muscle.
You gotta
In
get
Tokyo,
off the box,
Singapore, and the foreign quarters of Shanghai, young radicals were turning out revolutionary books and magazines by the stack. Neither government nor culture was sacred. In their papers, the feminist
Nice.
revolutionary Chujin argued against foot binding and forced marriage. She pledged to die rather than betray the revolution and walked the streets of Tokyo dressed in a Western man's suit. And these radical publications started promoting
What a
Soon's
Chad.
ideas. Within months, Soon drew the radicals and rebels into an alliance and started to plan new revolts. In fact, over the next 6 years, he would plan, coordinate, or sponsor 8 uprisings. And increasingly, student revolutionaries graduated and took positions in the new army, China's
Student revolutionaries, that's like a long-running tradition of like young intellectuals leading revolution. I mean, there's obviously like parallels with the Russian Revolution, with the with Vietnam. There was like a huge presence of student activism. It's very common that a lot of revolutionary action starts with young often college-educated people.
modernized military force, converting other officers to their cause, and at times, even bringing whole army units into the risings. But they failed. Every
Ah,
single one. And
Man,
it began to take its toll.
what a
Each
shame.
revolt meant dead comrades, old friends, and young followers, sometimes in their hundreds. After a failed bomb plot in 1901, assassins hired by the governor of Guangzhou gunned Young Ku Wan down at his desk. Days later, another of
That's the
Su's
thing from
agents in
earlier.
Hong Kong died in a suspicious poisoning. And in 1907, the Qing arrested Xu Jin. She'd been heading up revolutionary activity in her home province, and the secret police learned her name while torturing prisoners ahead of a planned uprising. Her articles provided enough evidence for a death sentence. There were consequences for Sun as well. Fearing for their reputation, the Japanese expelled him in 1907. He moved his base to Hanoi, and when the French kicked him out, he went to Singapore. By 1911, he was banned from most Asian countries, and the organization was nearly broke. They poured almost everything into the 10th uprising. 10 failed uprisings. The kindling burned, but the logs didn't catch. Discouraged and heartsick, he went to raise more funds in the US. He had no idea that the 11th uprising was about to begin. And this
Jeez.
time, the fire would rage.
This is intense. And wait, how many episodes do we have of this? Because it feels like something about this feels like it's taking its sweet time. It's got 5 episodes, so we're on 3 out of 5. So we are more than halfway done. And it's not like I'm rushing to get it done. I'm just like, don't. The thing you're doing right now, just don't do that. Oh, hold on, trying a thing. Gonna give him something. Hey. Alright, I'll try that. Thank you. Don't worry about him. I got him. Where was I? Here I am. Here we go. Let's go into part
Revolutionary
4.
Safe House.
This guy's
Wuchang,
fascinating.
October 9th.
Okay, he seems
1911.
content now.
The bomb
I figured it
maker
out.
gingerly places the device with the others. In a few days, these explosives will signal revolutionary
This guy's tenacious or plain nuts. Well, to perform revolutionary action, you'd have to be a little bit nuts. Just a little bit. Idealistic to like an extreme.
and army
never mind,
officers,
he's not
along
better.
with students and activists to take up arms. He reaches for another device. The house's doors and windows blow out. Dust swirls the streets. Qing police arrive, and they find a membership book. A book full of army officers' names. They realize where the
Remember that
explosives
problem
came
from earlier? Where they
Police
burned
begin
that book?
hammering on doors. After 16 years of
Now we can
planning,
see how this
the
actually
revolution
plays
is
out.
about to begin by accident.
Under different circumstances, we're going to see how that plays out.
The revolutionaries in Wuchang were not part of Sun's faction. They were influenced by Sun and in contact with his alliance, but this uprising, the Wuchang uprising, turned on local issues. See, when the Empress Dowager and Emperor died in 1908, the Emperor's 2-year-old son inherited the throne. And with the conservative Dowager Empress gone, officials ruling on behalf of the child emperor scrambled to implement reforms. They made moves towards constitutional monarchy, but it was too little too late. Every reform seemed a half measure, and they reneged on promises more than once. The Qing had burned all their credibility, and rumors swirled that they secretly planned to sell China out to foreigners. At which point, they decided to take over the rail networks with foreign money and under foreign control. When people protested, Qing troops shot them. Outrage followed. Local revolutionaries in Wuchang planned to make their move, plotting an uprising between the secret societies and sympathizers in the new army, until the accidental bombing forced their hand. October 10th, Double 10 Day. Police round up new army soldiers at random. Tensions are boiling hot. Several officers from the 8th Engineering Battalion corner a sergeant. They suspect he supplied the explosives, or knows who did. Tempers flare. The sergeant draws his revolver. Seconds later, the officers lie dead. The sergeant rallies his unit to mutiny and seize the city's arsenal. New
Oh.
army soldiers tie white cloths around their arms to mark themselves as revolutionaries. The street fighting begins. Revolutionaries
dude.
storm the city's fort, sending the governor and
So once the revolution actually kicks off, it may not necessarily be in the control of those who started it. And I'm curious to how much Sun Yat-sen can maintain his ideals in a situation like this, because now it's certainly much bigger than what it started as. It's much bigger than him.
commanding general into flight. Leaderless, the victory-drunk rebels move on to the neighboring city and force a popular army commander at gunpoint to become their commander. They make him draft telegrams to other provincial governments urging them to rise up. More units mutiny. More provinces expel the Qing. In some places, it's nearly a bloodless coup, but in others, revolutionaries massacre Qing officials and Manchu ethnic minorities. By early December,
That's not
only 8
ideal.
of China's 22 provinces remain under imperial control. Sun, meanwhile, finds out about the uprising from a newspaper article in Denver. And 4 days later, he learns, again by newspaper, that he's been proposed as the first president of the Republic. He didn't go back. Not immediately. Reasoning that he was a better diplomat than general, he instead hit Washington, D.C., London, and Paris. He wanted assurances that the Western powers would not intervene and would prevent Japanese intervention. He wanted a grant of loans to the new Republican government, and all loans to the Qing canceled. He was not successful exactly. None of the West.
This is like more the actions of like John Adams during the revolution rather than like a George Washington, somebody who's like dabbling in like because when the Americans wanted independence, yeah, there's the people who are fighting domestically, but then there are the people who are fighting overseas for money and support, and that's people like Benjamin Franklin, people like John Adams, who kind of hung around with the British and the French and the Dutch as well, and he secured like a Dutch loan for the Americans in their kind of startup country. So like nobody would compare Sun Yat-sen like personally or idealistically to a John Adams, but that's more the role he seems like he's taking.
Western powers were taking bets on the outcome of the revolution quite yet. They would withhold all loans until a single legitimate government ruled China. No money for the revolutionaries, but no money for Beijing either. He'd accomplished little. But when he arrived in Shanghai on Christmas Day, he found that the diplomatic tour raised his prestige. And 4 days later, the Provincial Assembly overwhelmingly elected Sun as provisional president of the Republic of China. They swore him in on January 1st, 1912. Within 2 months, Sun had gone from an outcast rebel to the head of a republic. Yet there was no time to enjoy the moment. The revolutionary government was mired in peace talks, not just with each other, but with Yuan Shikai. Yuan was currently Prime Minister of Imperial China. He was a general who'd been instrumental in creating the new army, but Beijing had forced him into retirement over worries about his popularity with the troops. Called back due to the crisis,
makes him a little bit
he used the
dangerous.
court's desperation to secure both the office of Prime Minister and a series of reforms that gave in to many of the revolutionaries' demands for constitutional government, and just so happened to make the Prime Minister very powerful. Earlier peace negotiations had produced a deeply unpopular agreement between Yuan and the revolutionaries. But that agreement was void anyway. Whether China would be a republic or a constitutional monarchy was supposed to have been settled with a national convention. But the revolutionaries had jumped the gun and declared a republic when they elected Sun.
Yeah,
so
that
the
is
day after Sun assumed the presidency, he sat down with Yuan for
bit of
secret
a
peace
big
talks.
step.
Both Sun and Yuan were backed into a corner. Due to banking neutrality, neither state could secure foreign loans, and both had armies teetering on the verge of financial collapse. Neither could afford to continue fighting each other. If they worked out an agreement, though, credit could resume. If not, it would be bankruptcy and civil war. So Yuan made his play. He could convince the emperor to abdicate and recognize the republic. In return, Sun would resign the
He
presidency
could make him.
and let Yuan take his place. Sun had little choice, and his
Oh.
dream wasn't to be president. It was to end Qing rule and replace it with a republic.
So, on the face of it, it would seem like this would be just fine to him, but he's handing power over to somebody who's clearly gunning for it. The scariest thing is somebody in power who really wants to be in power, which is honestly most people who get power. But you'd rather somebody in the position of Sun, because it's not his ideal. It's kind of like a duty. It's from sense of duty that he would take on that role. This other guy, I don't know him from a hole in the ground. He could be the next terrible dictator for all I know. He might end up becoming one. I don't know. I don't know how this ends.
This compact
We got another
secured
episode and
that.
a half.
He'd put country over self. So he agreed, but with two caveats. The provisional president would lead from the new capital, not from his power base in Beijing, and Yuan would honor the constitution. All bills must go before parliament. Yuan went north to Beijing. 6 weeks later, the 5-year-old emperor and the officials that controlled him officially abdicated the throne, bringing 268 years of Qing rule and 2,000 years of imperial
What up, dude?
rule to a close in China. Sun resigned effective April 1st, and parliament officially elected Yuan as the new president. Afterward, Sun conducted a ceremony in front of the first Ming emperor's tomb, officially conveying that the Qing usurpers had fallen and the Ming dynasty had been avenged. But it soon became clear Yuan was not coming back from Beijing. When called by parliament, he instigated a fake coup, then claimed he had to stay to put down the rebellion. Parliament
This guy's
compromised and
garbage.
moved the capital to Beijing.
He's already awful.
In response, Sun, who had not been idle, released the new constitution. Originally, he had planned for it to be an American-style government. But when it became clear that Yuan would lead, he advocated a British-style government that limited presidential power. The result was an ambiguous hybrid that left room for Yuan and ministers to split hairs over presidential power. In the end, that flawed document would be Sun's presidential legacy, along with a Western calendar and the 5-colored flag, meant to represent the equality
That's a wonderful
of China's
flag.
5 major ethnic groups. Sun's allies formed a new political party, the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, to oppose Yuan. But to keep the peace, Sun tried to be apolitical, and largely handed control of the party to his friend Song Jiaoren, and took a government position as the head of railway construction. Meanwhile, Yuan Shikai drove out members of parliament opposed to his government, and stacked it—
I mean, trying to not be political is inherently a political decision as well. Just like not voting is a political decision. So, like, I don't know. It's one of those things you can never really fully separate as a political figure, you can't fully separate yourself from politics. It just doesn't happen.
with loyalists.
Your lack of
appointing his
action
own
is
man
an
as
action.
Prime Minister. So in the 1913 elections, Song Jiaoren and the Nationalist Party campaigned hard on a platform of protecting government institutions from Yuan's undue influence. A young, charismatic speaker, the 30-year-old Song had warned that Yuan would make himself emperor. The Nationalists won an overwhelming majority. Everyone expected Song to become prime minister, until an assassin gunned him down on a train platform. An assassin investigators linked to Yuan's circle. That was March.
No.
In April, Yuan took out a £25 million loan from foreign powers, without consulting parliament. In May, he ceded control of Outer Mongolia to Russia. None of this sat well with the nationalists. And when nationalists in parliament accused Yuan of abusing his power and called for a permanent constitution, he declared them rebels and mobilized the army.
Oh, this
Sun
guy's
and
awful.
his people went for their guns. The second revolution was at hand. But Yuan's army was just too large. Within 2 months, Sun and his nationalists were back where they'd started, sitting in exile in Japan, trying to overthrow a government in Beijing. From rebel to president and back, all in a little over 2 years. And they watched from afar as Yuan dissolved parliament, watched as he declared democracy a failed experiment, replacing their constitution with a document giving him unlimited power. watched as he handed provinces out to generals who ruled as military
Oh
governors.
god, I hate this guy.
Watched Yuan accept economic demands that, if they came to pass, would make China a Japanese protectorate. And finally, watched as Yuan crowned himself emperor. It had been 20 years since Sun's first uprising, and things had come full circle.
You blew it
There was
up.
an emperor in
You were the chosen one. You were supposed to destroy the despots, not join them. Bring balance to China, not declare yourself emperor, you prick. Oh no.
Beijing. Sun was in exile, and he and his comrades were planning an uprising.
We got one last episode. I guess we'll see what happens.
Shanghai, 1916. Sun Yat-sen has returned from exile with troops. Yuan Shikai has finally gone too far. When he declared himself emperor,
This
everyone
fisheye
from
thing they're doing
revolutionary
is
groups
really
to
cool.
his trusted lieutenants rose against him. Customs refused to send him tax revenue, and Japan funds an anti-Yuan insurgency. But Sun's campaign is struggling. Nationalist operations barely get off the ground before Yuan's men assassinate his best lieutenant. Then he gets a message. Yuan is gone. Under pressure and
Oh,
ill,
great.
the old man had abdicated the throne, abolished the monarchy, and died in disgrace.
What?
There was a new president, but that was just for show. China belonged to the warlords now.
Oh, okay. He came in and fricked up everything and just peaced out? I was expecting like a final battle type thing, but no.
Yuan is dead, and China ignites into a cycle of never-ending crisis. Instead of restoring constitutionalism, his death shattered the young democracy. Yuan's massive northern army broke into cliques under his lieutenants. Troops pillaged the local population, collecting taxes at gunpoint. Foreign mercenaries, military advisors, and soldiers of fortune of all stripes poured into China. Some warlords only control a single province. The most powerful dominate 2 or 3. A few seize power in hopes of guarding constitutionalism until the republic can reemerge.
Oh,
But the
isn't that
majority
sweet?
govern through naked exploitation. In Manchuria, Japanese interests back a warlord who's basically a bandit king, giving them open access to China's industrial heartland.
This isn't like
Everyone
almost the.
wants
This is
Beijing.
the
Whoever holds the
1910s.
capital gets both foreign recognition and access
This
to
isn't
tax
even that
revenue.
long ago.
So the warlords take it from each other again and again. In the 12 years following Yuan's death, China will have no less than 6 heads of state and 25 different political cabinets. The dethroned child emperor, now a political pawn, will get briefly reinstalled twice. This marked the darkest period in Sun's life. His flower of Republican China had been snipped before it could bloom. 2 decades worth of work destroyed. Even after the Japanese agreed to fund his rebellion, he'd arrived too late and once again lost the initiative. His nationalists played little part in dethroning Yuan. The warlords all had more troops. Sun questioned everything. He decided it had been naive to expect China to simply transition to democracy. The people were unfamiliar with it, and a new republic with its inherent factionalism could never stand up against authoritarian warlords. So he wouldn't found a democracy then, at least not at first. His next government would be a single-party military one, with the hope of securing the country and instructing the people in republican government before transitioning to democracy.
Oh, that's terrible. It's not going to work.
Into a party
Sounds like a
that
bad
stressed
idea.
Obedience to political doctrine. A move that drove away some allies. And with few options available, he relied on Shanghai's criminal.
I mean, I'm not surprised that he's like shifting towards something that comes off as a little bit more authoritarian with how much he's failed so far. Like, he's tried doing things kind of the right way, sort of. And it's just effed him over. So I kind of get how somebody could be driven to do something that seems so antithetical in the name of what he's trying to do, because it's him just taking different routes to try to get to the same end. But it doesn't seem good. It doesn't seem like it'll work.
Syndicates to serve
I
as
don't
foot
know.
soldiers. These weren't triads. Triads were rebel groups. These were
Clearly it
gangsters.
hasn't worked.
And from those ranks came a new lieutenant, an infantry officer named Chiang Kai-shek. Brutal but effective, Chiang brought a ruthlessness to the nationalists that Sun lacked. Sun disliked killing and tried to avoid it. Shang, by contrast, once assassinated a man as he lay in a hospital bed.
That's bad.
With these new allies, Sun traveled to Guangzhou and formed his new state, declaring it China's legitimate government. Members of parliament loyal to Sun convened and declared him Grand Marshal, and he began preparing a military campaign, a northern expedition to retake the country. And with the nation split over whether China should enter World War I, Sun sought funds from both allied
Oh yeah,
and
World War
Central
I's
powers,
happening.
trying to play
Jeez.
one against the other. Other than secret support from Germany, he received little. On top of that, Sun's
Neron, you missed so much. I don't even know how to run you down everything that you have missed. There, it's just like everything was going so well, and he blew it. So some dummy came in, declared himself emperor, just pieced out, ruined everything. It's really sad.
first northern expedition failed. He was outmatched. His forces were so small, he couldn't even remain in Guangzhou unless the provincial warlords allowed it. By 1918, they grew tired of Sun, killed his bodyguards and chief lieutenant, and removed him as Grand Marshal. His government collapsing, Sun fled to his house in Shanghai to write. And this period of self-doubt leaked into Sun's private life as well. While in exile 3 years before, Sun married his young secretary. Despite the scandal, due to the fact he never officially divorced his first wife, the new
these revolutionaries are such horn
indispensable
dogs.
to setting down his political philosophy. For 2 years, Sun wrote as much as possible. He restated his plans for a republican government and argued that any future republic must include the right to both elect and recall officials. He collected essays into books, and he set out a radical infrastructure plan, proposing that China lay down over 100,000 miles of rail and roads to connect its cities, dam the Yangtze River for hydroelectric power, and establish 2 new ports. Though deeply unrealistic at the time, it would essentially create the development plan China still follows today.
Oh,
And soon,
interesting.
might have ended there. An elder statesman dreaming of the future, if not for the Treaty of Versailles. See, China's entry...
Which one? I always bring this up. There's like 20 treaties of Versailles. I find it kind of personal because I said the Treaty of Versailles in another context, and somebody like berated me over it, and I was like, "Isn't there's more than one Treaty of Versailles?" And they were like, "No, you're wrong." And I'm still mad about that because there's like so many treaties of Versailles. Can't get mad at somebody for being like, which one?
Into World War I divided the country, especially since Japan had used the war as a pretext to invade German possessions in China and solidify its control over the Beijing government. So when the Treaty of Versailles let Japan keep Chinese territory it invaded, the betrayal was too much. China had joined the Allies despite having little interest in the war, and their reward for being on the winning side was to lose territory.
That's
Mass
bad.
protests followed, with a younger generation of students emerging as leaders. New forces like the Communist Party of China sprung up, arguing
Here
for
we
an
go.
alliance with their new revolutionary kin in Soviet Russia. And one of these young, motivated revolutionaries was an assistant university librarian named Mao Zedong.
Oh, there we
At
go.
first,
Here
Sun
he is.
dismissed this new cultural movement as a passing fad. But it had quickly become clear that this youth movement had staying power, and that
Sun
they had
Yat-sen.
respect for Sun's new, outspoken style. In his writing years, Sun became more openly anti-colonial. Years of eliciting support from foreign powers had worn him down. He raged against hypocrisy of governments like the United States that praised democratic systems but supported the autocratic warlords. He upgraded Japan.
The United States, like overtly supports so many of the world's dictatorships, even to this day. Our government doesn't have a whole lot of good faith on that issue. And a lot of time has passed since this time.
Japan for emulating Western colonialism rather than siding with other Asian nations. And he called for a canceling of all unequal treaties that foreign governments had imposed via military force. And those positions proved extremely popular with the young New Culture revolutionaries. And that popularity boost came at a crucial time. A Sun-friendly warlord retook Guangzhou, allowing him to return in 1920 and form a second military government. But it lasted only 7 months before Sun set off on another well-timed northern expedition. A rival seized Guangzhou in his absence and forced Sun to hop on a gunboat and evacuate to Shanghai. And unfortunately, he'd left behind some papers proposing an alliance between the countries who'd lost the most in the Treaty of Versailles, namely China, Germany, and Soviet Russia. This revelation, as well as Sun's difficulty in working with progressive warlords and constitutionalists in Beijing, tarnished his legitimacy. While still respected as an elder statesman, public opinion increasingly cast Sun as irrelevant. Abandoned by both domestic and foreign allies, Sun turned to the only ones offering aid, the Soviets. Russia's new government was, strangely
might fit
enough,
in with
a
some of
fairly
them.
natural ally. Like China, it was a revolutionary state. The two shared a border. Communist doctrine considered anti-colonial movements brothers in arms. And finally, Soviet Russia was the only nation that committed to return Chinese territory and abolish unequal treaties. Plus, the Soviets were sending agents to help advise and undermine governments across the globe. And Sun wanted their advice, money, and weapons. He needed it
Hell
for starters,
yeah,
but
he
it was
does.
also clear that if he didn't accept it, someone else would. In the ensuing agreement, Russia recognized Sun as the leader of China, agreed to support his bid for national reunification, and formally renounced most Russian claims to China itself. Sun, for his part, made it clear that he would not be accepting the Soviet model, but that he would allow individual Chinese communists to join the Nationalist Party. Under the table, though, the agreement provided Sun with money, arms, and Soviet training to help him reorganize the nationalists and establish military academies. So as Sun returned to Guangzhou again, establishing his third military government, things finally looked up. He'd regained legitimacy through foreign recognition,
Oh,
his
really?
reputation recovering. The nationalists were, at last, becoming a military force, building up a new northern expedition. Warlords in Beijing courted him. Foreign governments, even Hong Kong, which had once banned him, finally treated him like a major political figure. Now, he did have
Nice.
to
Good
violently
for
suppress
good
an
for that
uprising
boy.
in Guangzhou when merchants chafed against his taxes, sure.
Oh, that's
but
not good.
overall, things were never better. And in 1924, a progressive warlord invited him to meet in Beijing, offering hope that a political settlement could reunite China without the bloodshed Sun so despised. He began feeling ill on the way. By the time he'd reached the capital, it was clear something was wrong. A
Oh
doctor
no, he's not gonna
confirmed
make
the
it.
diagnosis: terminal liver cancer. Sun died 3 months later, his wife by his side. In a time when most Chinese political leaders built vast fortunes, he could only leave her his personal papers and a house in Shanghai. 3 years later, a nationalist honor guard carries Sun's coffin into a great mausoleum, laying it under a stone sarcophagus. The ceremony is propaganda as well as memorial. After a short power struggle following Sun's death, Chiang Kai-shek had emerged as the nationalist leader and finally launched the Northern Expedition. It had succeeded. The nationalists had taken Beijing, though warlords still controlled much of the country, and Chiang actually ruled from Nanjing. But during the expedition, a rift opened up between the hardline nationalists and Chinese communists. Chiang ordered a purge, executing thousands of Chinese communists and setting the stage for a civil war that would tear the country apart for the next 20 years. But throughout those bitter times, as men who could agree on nothing slaughtered each other in service of Chiang and Mao, they both revered
Mao's
one
gonna
figure.
rise up
One
out of that.
called him the father of the nation, the other the forerunner of the democratic revolution. Yet it was the same man, Sun Yat-sen.
I'm glad that I learned about this. That's kind of a fascinating figure right there. As far as revolutionaries go, I love learning about them, like no matter where they come from, and this kind of broadens revolutionary history to me. It kind of like opens up a whole new avenue to learn about it through China, which is not something that I typically learn about. I've done very little when it comes to Asian history, but this is a guy who I actually am very interested in. He's so unique in his he has like a strong nationalistic ideal, but it's not necessarily traditional, and he borrows so much from other revolutionary and Western cultures and all that, which it's all incredibly fascinating. And this is something I would definitely like to build upon at some point and learn a little bit more about him. Like each individual moment, I could probably like do like a deep dive into some of it. I don't know. There's a lot of possibility here.